Yorkshire's West Riding has been a hub for textile manufacturing since ancient times, becoming renowned for its northern broadcloths. In 1626, King Charles I had granted Leeds its first royal charter, acknowledging the inhabitants' long-standing expertise in crafting woolen broadcloth, especially the so-called northern dozens. A dozen, or half-piece, measured 12 to 13 yards in length and 63 inches in width, which is half the size and weight of a full northern broadcloth. This skill in weaving not only earned them recognition and praise, but also significantly increased the revenue for the Crown. Leeds, Halifax, Bradford and Wakefield were to become rich towns, said to depend wholly on clothiers weaving woolen broadcloths and northern dozens. Ossett, a relatively small township at the time, is 10 miles from Leeds, 3 from Wakefield and 11 from Bradford, so it was situated right in the heart of the West Riding woolen district. By the 1730s, Ossett had a population of about 400 and boasted more than 100 clothiers, small manufacturers who worked at home on handlooms. So many Ossett houses had a handloom in them that the township was said to be musical with the sound of their working, the looms creating a variety of rhythmic sounds, including beating, whirring, rattling and jangling. In many cases, the wool trade would be a full-time family business for these small manufacturers, with the wife spinning, the husband weaving, and the children combing and carding. The woven cloth was finished as undyed cloth, known as white cloth. Frequently the clothiers had to sell their pieces fresh from the loom in order to obtain money to buy wool for the next piece. So they took it to the cloth market as soon as they could and sold it to a merchant. A clothier might be lucky enough to own a horse to take his cloth pieces to market, but many others had to walk, carrying their cloth on their heads. The best cloth market from which to sell was at Leeds, where the first indoor white cloth hall for undyed cloth had opened in 1711, overtaking the Wakefield cloth market in popularity with merchants. About the year 1736, Richard Wilson, a young Ossett clothier, aged 26 and not yet married, made 2 northern broadcloths. He carried one of them on his head to the cloth market in Leeds, a distance of 10 miles. The Leeds White Cloth Hall on Kirkgate was where he was heading, and it was reputed to be unequalled in the country, at least until it was outgrown a few years later. It was a stately hall built on pillars over arches in the form of an exchange, with a quadrangle court at ground level and a cupola with a bell on top. The bell would ring to begin business at 6 a.m. every Tuesday and Saturday, so Richard would have to set off in the dark about 2 a.m. to be sure to be there before the market opened. The weight of his 24-foot-long broadcloth was at least 66 pounds, or 30 kilograms. The average height of a man in the 1730s was 5 foot 4 inches. But these men were used to hard work and long hours, and had to remain fit and healthy to survive. Richard would take some refreshment on arrival in Leeds and wait for the market to open its doors to the traders. He would put his cloth piece on a trestle, beside those of the other clothiers, and as soon as the bell stopped ringing, the merchants came along between the rows of boards, inspecting the various cloths. Now and then a merchant would reach over to a clothier and quietly whisper a price. A quick negotiation would take place and an agreement reached. To receive an order for half a dozen pieces would be doing business on a very grand scale, but most clothiers would only have 1 or 2 pieces to sell, and in a little more than an hour all the business was done and the clothier would carry the goods back to the merchant's lodging. The merchants, or woolmen, would later arrange to dye, finish and resell the cloth. Richard was lucky that day. He agreed a price and made a sale. He didn't need to run to the merchant's lodging at the end of the day to try to accept a lower price, assuming it was still on offer. In fact, not only did the merchant want his piece, but he also wanted to buy the matching broadcloth that was still back home in Ossett. So Richard had a decision to make, and it seems it wasn't difficult. He could walk back home and fetch the other piece. And that's what he did. He carried another £66 broadcloth back to Leeds that same day, presumably met the merchant at a local inn, completed the sale and walked back home again. He had walked 40 miles that day, and 20 of them carrying a very heavy load. This Richard Wilson was the brother of my 6 times great-grandfather Robert Wilson, who was also a clothier. Richard and Robert Wilson must have done well for themselves in the end, because they were among those Ossett men who contributed to the building of the chapel on the Green, a non-conformist place of worship that later became Ossett Congregational Church. Richard died in Ossett at the relatively young age of 49, leaving a widow and 3 children, but Robert lived to a ripe old age of 81. The first white cloth hall in Leeds, where the Wilson brothers once traded their cloth, saw numerous changes in its usage over the years. Unfortunately, it eventually fell into a state of disrepair and faced the risk of collapse. In 2019, a £3.9 million project began, which successfully restored this significant historic building. During the renovation, carbon dating revealed that the wooden trusses used in the original construction were sourced from trees growing during the years 1366 to 1476, that the trees were actually felled in the summer of 1476, and were evidently repurposed from an earlier building. This remarkable discovery highlights the historical significance of the first white cloth hall, linking its origins to the late medieval period and showcasing the resourcefulness of past builders in repurposing materials. My Wilson ancestors, a family of clothiers from Ossett, played just one small part in this rich history.